So we have class Tuesday, but not Thursday, correct?
For next week?
Yeah.
So we have the lab is a review, so the class is normal. So like the lecture piece is still normal. So next Tuesday will be a normal business day, like our usual lecture at 5 and then lab to follow. And then we'll just be kind of tying up all of our loose ends on Tuesday, covering all the last bits and pieces. Maybe we need a little extra coverage on things of that nature. And then Thursday will be a normal lecture day, and then we're off to break. And then when we come back, that Tuesday will be exam day for the lab exam, but there'll be a normal lecture that day. So what will happen on that day will be, Sarah and I will probably have set up the exam. We'll take the lab exam straight off. And then after everybody's done with the lab exam, we'll kind of clean up the room a little bit, and then we'll do our hour 15 lecture. And then that Thursday, which would be the 5th, would be our last kind of lecture day, our last Thursday class day. And then the following Tuesday would be the final exam for the chapter work. So yes, Daniel, the last lab exam will be the 3rd. Okay, any other questions? So that'll give us a little bit of extra processing time. So let's go ahead and pick up where we left off. So we left off, we're talking about integration. Now we got to talk a little bit about our pathways. We talked a little bit about them before. So ascending, descending tracks, things like that. And so we want to kind of flesh those out a little bit more directly as opposed to just sort of talking about them in passing. So the first one we're going to start off with is our sensory pathways. And so, well, Prativa, say that again. Hold on. What did you say? I just barely caught that.
Sorry, I thought the the lecture exam was like the Tuesday after Thanksgiving.
Yeah, so it's currently scheduled for that to be the lecture exam.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is that kind of shorts us some instructional time because that's actually technically still active semester. And not only that, but that would force us to have to take the lab exam like sooner than we want. And so what I did was put the lecture exam on finals week where everybody else is taking their exams.
Oh, okay.
So it's on the 10th now. And the 3rd will be lab exam.
All right, thank you.
Yep. So we're talking now about sensory inputs. So this is basically where you're going to be moving action potentials. So from the periphery of the body, those ascending tracks that we're going to be taking a look at that are heading from the sensory pathways that are cast hither and yon in the body. And then we're going to be moving those up the ascending tracks. And so generally speaking, we don't just have generic tracks. If you notice in the white matter of the spinal cord, and we learned about this in chapter 12, where you have those columns, right? The posterior columns, the lateral columns. So this is basically where you have some of these tracks going, right? For instance, in the dorsal column or the posterior column, you have 2 main tracks, the fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus. That's these 2 guys here. And so each one of these tracks, and of course you have, there's names for all these guys, right? So you have the spinocerebellar, the posterior and the anterior tracks. And then you have, the spino, what I call the spino group, the spinothalamic, spinoarticular, spinomesencephalic tracks that are basically taking ascending sensory inputs and they're moving up the system and they're delivering it to those particular localities, the thalamus, the reticular formation, and the mesencephalon. So those are the different regions of where they're going. And so each one of these basically are sort of segregated out and organized by the kind of information that they are moving through the system. So for instance, the first half is the origin of where it's coming from. So for instance, spinothalamic is coming from the spinal cord, whereas the second is its destination, the thalamus. And so you have a lot of these ascending tracks. So for instance, if you take a look at the spinothalamic track, this is a really big one, and a kind of a common one that we run into a lot. We've kind of talked a little bit about this one already, like when we were talking about the brain and the regions of the thalamus and the different tracks that were coming into it. So if you this is kind of a cool little image here. What they've done basically is they've just taken cross sections of the central nervous system in different areas of the central nervous system. Like for instance, cross section of it down here in the spinal cord, as opposed to a cross section in the medulla oblongata, a cross section of the pons, the midbrain, and then it's a coronal section of the brain itself. And so this is really kind of helpful because it kind of shows you how the tract itself sort of progresses from one station of the central nervous system to the next. And so how some of these sections will kind of develop and kind of convey themselves. So the important thing about this one in particular is this is a big one that we like to talk about a lot, because essentially this is giving us our conscious perception, right? So our perception, not just in general, but of like the external stimulus. So pain, for instance, temperature, light, pressure, tickle, itch, all these are going through this particular pathway. And so you're going to be going from that posterior horn of the spinal cord. It's going to synapse with interneurons. That's the primary. So there's like a 3-neuron system. So you have a primary neuron, a secondary, and then a tertiary neuron. And so the primary, which is going to be down here, focusing on this one. So here's our primary neuron down here. This is where you're going to be picking up the original stimulus, right? This is associated with those sensory receptors. It's going to be bringing that information in. It's going to be going through that sort of dorsal end, right? So that's basically going from the dorsal side into that posterior horn. You might remember that from chapter 12. And so this is going through that dorsal root ganglion. And then it's going to be moving into that posterior horn. It's going to cut through the commissure through these, an interneuron, basically heading up to the secondary neuron. And so this little guy right here, it's kind of small, but kind of blow it up, that little interneuron right there, it's going to relay through an interneuron. And then the pathway is going to go through the commissure, so the white commissure, and then it's going to basically move up into the spinal thalamic tract. And then from there, it's going to move upwards. So it's kind of like you're basically routing your information, your sensory information, from the point of reception, and you're relaying it into in this case, the gray matter of the spinal cord. And then you're going to be moving it into sort of these major, you can think of them almost as like freeways, right? Or super highways of information that's kind of going up and down. So this is kind of like the express lane, so to speak. And so you're going to empty that into the express lane of the spinal thalamic tract, and that's going to be heading up through the medulla oblongata. And so you can see where your spinal thalamic tract is in the medulla oblongata, so you can map it out. Now, if you're taking like a neurology class, you'd be memorizing all these little cross sections and maps of tracts and things like that. But that's a little beyond our focus here. And then you're going to be moving to the secondary neuron. So this is basically where you're going to cross over to the other side. And so what's going to happen is this will ascend up to the thalamus. So you can see the secondary goes through the pons, and then it's going to go through the secondary, which is going to cross over. And then it's going to head toward the thalamus itself. So you can see the thalamus area right in here. So this whole area right in here. And so once it does that, then it's going to relay to the tertiary neuron, which is basically the sensory cortex. So you can kind of see it's going to basically be that final leg, that final delivery to that sensory cortex region that's in the cerebrum. So ultimately what you have is essentially a multi-step kind of a relay system where you have multiple different pieces involved. It's almost kind of like an Amazon delivery system. Actually, that's kind of cool, because we've all done Amazon delivery. I don't know about you guys, but if you watch like me, because you want to get your stuff like now, and how many of you guys are like, once you order something on Amazon, it's like you're constantly like obsessively checking the latest tracking data? Am I the only one doing that? Right? And if you notice, what happens is there's multiple steps, right? Like it'll originate like from somewhere, God knows where, right? And then it'll say it arrives at, the shipper's, and then it'll say like received, and then it's sent out to another one. And sometimes it relays it through a couple of shippers, especially if it's coming from overseas, right? And so you see these, like, it kind of gets handed off. And then eventually you'll see it's like it makes it somewhere here in Colorado, oftentimes maybe Commerce City if it's coming by UPS or something of that nature, depending on who the carriers are. And so you kind of see these like legs, and then ultimately you kind of see that final leg of the delivery, where you actually have that final person who's kind of delivering it. So that's kind of what's going on here, right? You kind of have your site of origin, and then you kind of go through all these sort of different sort of delivery apparatuses in order to get it to the point of destination. So before Amazon figured out their delivery system, our central nervous system had it figured out a long time ago. So how smart is Bezos now? Sorry. He's actually probably pretty smart. I mean, he did a great job with his company, so I can't give him too much grief. Besides, I live on Amazon, so I wish Bezos good health and success, because his success is convenient for me. Okay, so the other members of the anterolateral system. So we have, we talked about the spinothalamic. Now we're going to be taking a look at spinoreticulae and the spinomesencephalic tract, right? So these guys are going to be carrying pain. They're going to be looking at pain and touch to other parts of the brain, where oftentimes you don't have a conscious. So this is like sort of subconscious perception of pain and touch, right? So for instance, in this particular case, the axons that are going through spinothalamic will divert to the midbrain and other brainstem nuclei. And a piece of the mesencephalic tract itself is part of what we refer to as the spinotectal tract. Now, there's a lot of subdivisions of these tracts. If you actually get into a good neurology book, I mean, there's like all kinds of stuff all over the place, and so it gets a little crazy. So we're trying to streamline it as much as possible. But oftentimes what'll happen is part of the spinal, the tectal tract will head to the superior colliculus. And if you remember, the superior colliculus is part of that corpora quadrigemina piece of the midbrain. And remember, this is that one that is associated with visual tracking. And your visual tracking is linked with your head turn reflex, right? So part of your ability to track visually is to not just recognize and lock on to the object, but also to be able to turn your head as you're following your target. And so that's kind of like an awareness of where that stimulation is coming from. And so this is kind of what it looks like. So they're kind of all related in the sense that they have, I mean, you can, if you want to be general about it, you can split this into sort of conscious versus non-conscious pain, touch, reception, and integration. And so a lot of times with our superior colliculus, there are some things where we can consciously control it. So for instance, if I walk across the room, you can choose whether or not to visually track me or not. So there's a bit of a voluntary piece to it as well. But there's also kind of a bit of a subconscious track to it as well. Like for instance, if you take a look at another piece of the corpora quadrigemina, the inferior colliculus, which is your auditory tracking, I mean, you can choose to track me across the room, but if you really think about it, you really can't choose, can you? Because if I stand in the far corner of the room and I start talking, you immediately recognize that I'm in the far corner of the room. Whether you intend to track me across the room or not, you're immediately aware of the fact that I'm in the far corner of the room. So you've not only heard me, you are aware of me, and you can also localize me. And that's all subconscious, right? So that's all kind of those are the sorts of things we're talking about when we're talking about this sort of connection between this non-conscious perception, especially as it sort of fleshes itself out in the spinal mesencephalic tract as it sort of interacts with the spinal tectal tract on the superior colliculus. So they're just pieces where you automatically are aware of me in the room and where I am, right? So there's a conscious sense of awareness of that, and that's kind of some of the things we're talking about here. So let's take a look at the dorsal column or the posterior column. So we refer to this as a medial lemniscal system, and so we have different types of sensations going on here. So these guys are going to be connecting, first of all, to different types of sensation. For instance, 2-point discrimination, which some of you guys did with the calipers, deep pressure, right? We talked a little bit about that with the Pacinian corpuscles. Vibration, your sense of vibration, and proprioception, that's kind of a sense of awareness, so to speak, on a very granular level. And so we start off, first of all, with the sensation, right? So the receptor piece of it, notice we have it kind of broken down on the same pathway. So we have our primary neurons, essentially, which has specific cell bodies designated to it in the dorsal root ganglion. And so the axons then will enter the spinal cord and will go up to the medulla without decussating. Remember, decussating is crossing over. That's basically when you switch, when you go across. Like, for instance, when you guys saw the optic chiasm, where the way the two optic nerves basically cross over. So your right eye goes to your left brain and your left eye goes to your right brain. That's decussation. So these guys go up into the medulla oblongata, where you get a lot of decussation, obviously, a lot of times. But in this case, they don't. And so they'll go and they'll move into the secondary neurons at this particular point. So the primaries don't. So they don't do that. And so this is kind of like where we are now. First of all, you're going to take in your sensory reception from the Pacinian corpuscle. It's going to move into the dorsal root ganglion, which is going to be this guy right here. So that's basically the cell bodies of the primary neuron that's essentially taking in this sensory information. And then that's going to be moving into the posterior horn again, and then it's going to start moving up. Notice it doesn't decussate. That means it doesn't cross over at this point. So when the spinal thalamic tract crossed over, that was decussing, basically, when it kind of crosses over through that commissure. So in this case, it stays on the same side and starts to ascend and goes up to the medulla oblongata, where it's going to pass it on to the decussation, or the neuron that goes through the decussation. So you can see it's basically going to pass it on to the secondary, which will then cross over and then move into the opposite tract, the opposite side of, in this case, the medulla oblongata. And that's your secondary. At that particular point, you're in your secondary. So the secondary neuron is the one that decussates and then starts to ascend up to the thalamus itself. So you can see it's going to go through the pons, through the medial lemniscus, and then it's going to enter into the thalamus, just like the other neuron with the spinal thalamic tract. And then it's going to switch off to your tertiary neuron, which is again going to take it to your primary somatic sensory region. Remember, this is one of the reasons why we learned these in the brain anatomy. Remember, we learned about the primary motor gyrus, right? So the premotor and the post central and the precentral gyrus. That's basically those two little ridges that are around that central sulcus. And remember, Precentral was the motor cortex. That's where your spinal thalamic was going. And in this particular case, you're taking in sensory information. So it's going to be going to that somatosensory cortex, which is that postcentral gyrus. So that's the reason why that gyrus system, especially with the central sulcus right there, is so critical, because this is where you're getting a lot of these tracks moving, is they initially move to these particular regions, those two gyri. That's the reason why we're learning those pre and post central gyri. Okay, so that's basically what's kind of happening here. First of all, the one thing that I forgot to mention on my way up there was the obvious pieces. The whole reason why we're on this slide is where the fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus actually is involved here. And so they're involved because you're routing different types of information through these particular areas. So for instance, the mid-thoracic sensations are coming through the gracilis, and above mid-thorax, so a little upper thorax, is going to be cuneatus. And so that's basically what's happening here. So you can see it goes through the posterior horn, and then it goes through either fasciculus gracilis or cuneatus, depending on where you are. And then that's where it starts to move up through up to the medulla oblongata. So it basically goes from gray to the white columns, and then from the columns through the tract. And then once it gets to the medulla oblongata, it decussates and crosses over. So by the end of this chapter, and by the end of neurology, you guys should probably feel like electricians. Chapter 12 probably made you feel like electricians. Only in this case, we don't have colored wires. They're all the same color. Okay, so the trigem has its own tract. So the trigeminothalamic tract. So where this is cranial 5. And so the fibers of this particular tract essentially will join or merge with the spinal thalamic. And that'll happen in the brainstem once that spinal thalamic enters the brainstem. And then the secondary neurons, just like we saw before, are the ones that decussate in the brainstem. So remember, the brainstem is a really big kind of a central area where you get a lot of decussation. And then, of course, just like before, the tertiaries run from the thalamus, and then they go to the primary somatosensory cortex. So you can kind of see it's a similar sort of thing. The difference is you're joining in at a slightly different area. And so this particular case, you have similar information to the lemnal meniscal system, or the medial lemniscal system. But the focus here is, remember, the trigem is innervating the face and the nasal cavity and the oral cavity, what I like to call deep face, right? So facial muscles are superficial muscles. So the facial nerve is superficial muscles, muscles of expression, things like that. And then the deeper structures that are below that, the hardware, the working stuff that's below that, is going to be trigem. And so this, so that's an important connection. So you get basically immediate sensation from that cranial nerve as it kind of comes in and routes itself. Notice the pathways are starting to become very similar now, right? Because now we've had a couple of different tracks that have been going up, and they've been routing through similar pathways, right? So we basically, the pattern is similar. On the lower end, you're getting sensory reception that gets relayed through the spinal cord, and then it gets separated out into one of those tracks. And then oftentimes, once it reaches the medulla oblongata, then we have decussation, right, where it crosses over. And then oftentimes from there, it heads straight to the thalamus, and from the thalamus, it gets sorted out either into the motor cortex, depending on the motor, or it gets moved into the sensory cortex. So the pattern is very similar. We're starting to see a repeating pattern. So let's go ahead and take a look then at the spinocerebellar tracts. And so this is important because it's going to be taking proprioceptive information. going to be moving that to the cerebellum. And this is largely, in fact, when you're dealing with the cerebellum, you're usually talking largely about unconscious types of things. So what happens here is you're basically taking now proprioception. Remember, you're kind of like, we mentioned this is kind of like body awareness, but it's also regulation. So like, for instance, in this particular case, and this is actually a pretty good description of how proprioception works, right? So basically you have actual movements that are actually happening, and these are going to be monitored, right? That creates sensory information. So the actual physical movement of your body. And then you can cross-reference this with the cerebral information of the intended movement. And then basically the difference between the two gives you a sense of kind of awareness and how you're doing it, right? So this is kind of like an idea of like, well, wait a minute, I want to touch a particular spot on the wall. And so your cerebral intention is to control your muscles so that you can touch the spot on the wall. But as you're actually reaching out to touch it, what's happening is as your muscles are contracting and you're not quite there yet, you're constantly comparing your movements that you're making with where you want them to go so that you can basically make, on the spot changes in musculature. So if you're overshooting it, you can correct it, change your muscle contraction because your actual movements are not matching your intended movements, and it allows you to be able to correct and then touch the actual spot on the wall. So that basically requires proprioception. It requires your body to basically relay constant stream of sensory information about how actions are moving versus how they're intended to move, and then correcting for the discrepancy between the two. That requires a lot of positional awareness. And that's kind of a good example of how proprioception kind of helps. So you typically will have anterior and posterior tracks associated with this. So these guys can get a little squirrely. So some can cross, some will recross again in the cerebellum. So ultimately it'll go to the same side as the sensation came from, but by kind of a little bit of a circuitous route. And so here you can see an example in this case. So your amount of stretch, so this is kind of like a proprioceptor, right? Your Golgi tendon organ. And so this basically will sense that information. That primary neuron will take it in. It'll relay through the posterior horn. There'll be a relay that goes through the anterior horn. So it's kind of going from posterior down to anterior. It'll shoot up the secondary neuron in the posterior spinocerebellar tract. And then it'll go up and then to the cerebellum, and then it'll interface into the cerebellum itself. And it passes through, some of you guys saw this, where that cerebellar peduncle, or those are those little post-like pieces of brain that connects one area of the brain to the other. That's your chapter 13 coming back for you. So those are the ascending pathways. So the descending pathways are typically going the opposite direction. So rather than collecting receptor information from your body and then moving it on up, what's happening here is that your information is coming from your brain and it's going down your spinal cord. So this is basically heading down. These are descending pathways, they're going down. And so ultimately, the descending tracks are oftentimes we associate these with motor responses. So they're sending motor signals, say, for instance, to your muscles. But a couple of things that can, other things they can do is, remember, these things aren't in isolation, and that's typically the case, right? So the nervous system structures, they're not like isolated from each other. They're kind of interconnected with each other. And so this is a perfect example here. For instance, the descending tracks can actually send like little offshoots or little branches to the ascending tracks. And by that, they can do something very, very important, which is release neuromodulators, especially things like endorphins and enkephalins. These both together are basically like natural morphine. So one of the things that a lot of times people who have gone through physical trauma notice is that at the point of trauma, if you ask them, it's like, wow, I mean, how much did that hurt? A lot of times people can't tell you, because what happens is as soon as you experience extreme physical trauma, is your body will flood your system with endorphins and enkephalins. And this is basically one of the pathways that it does. And so what that does is basically it kind of like it kind of dopes you up. It's kind of like natural morphine. And the idea is kind of like this. This is kind of like one of those sort of I guess nature's mercy kind of a thing. If you kind of want to compare this mechanism to, say, for instance, something that happens to other mammals, like for instance on the Serengeti. Remember, most animals, especially wild animals out there, they don't usually get to die peacefully. Like, we get to die peacefully a lot of times in our bed with loved ones around us, things like that. That's really pretty much limited to the human species. Most other animals usually will die a violent death, especially if you're a prey animal. And that's the reason why I like to think of like the zebra, right? Because typically a zebra, the way it's going to leave this world is probably by being eaten. Because even if the zebra gets old, it's going to get slow and the lion's going to catch it. And then what happens is the lion's sitting there ripping out the zebra's entrails. And oftentimes, if you look closely at some of those nature shows, when the lion has just killed the zebra and it's just taken the zebra down, if you look closely while the lion's kind of digging into the carcass, oftentimes that zebra's still alive. It hasn't died yet, which is kind of gruesome. But what happens is at that point of physical trauma, the body floods with endorphins, which kind of takes the zebra offline. I like to kind of think of it as sort of nature's gentle, kind of just petting the zebra, saying, there. You've lived a good life. You've had lots of little baby zebras. You've done a good job. Now it's time for the lion to eat, But I'm not going to make you suffer through this. I'm going to give you endorphins and enkephalins so that this isn't so hard. And that's basically what endorphins and enkephalins do. And a lot of times when we incur extreme physical trauma, a lot of times people don't remember like how much it hurt at the point, because their body was flooded with endorphins and enkephalins, and it does kind of takes you offline. It kind of reminds me a little bit of when I got into a car accident and the airbag went off, and I remember there's was an insurance commercial. This was about 10 years ago or so. And basically it opens up with like from the driver's perspective, kind of waking up in the airbag and then kind of having blurry vision and kind of not really knowing where they are, and realizing like that they had just been in a car accident. Like they didn't even know what was happening while it was happening. And that's exactly what these are like. Kind of at that point of attack, it's like you almost like wake up after the fact, and it's like you look around and you realize, oh, wait a minute, I was just in an accident. And so a lot of times you see people, for instance, during severe trauma doing like things that you would think, well, wait a minute, you're like really injured, you shouldn't be doing this. I think back to a scene in the movie Saving Private Ryan, where they took a shot of a soldier who was carrying his arm around because it had gotten blown off by a bomb. But that's kind of what enkephalins and endorphins do. They kind of take you offline, and like you don't even realize the pain that you're in because your body's just so flooded with these natural morphines. And so that's kind of an interesting piece of trauma physiology that occurs. Now, these endorphins and enkephalins are not long lasting. because anybody who's been through physical trauma will quite well tell you that definitely the pain showed up, and it usually isn't that long. You know, it showed up pretty quickly. So we're not talking about you get a pass for a couple of hours. We're talking about, you know, pretty quickly. So the pain does show up, but at that exact point, you don't really notice what's happening. And so as a result, that basically is an example of how these descending tracts can come in and modify that sensation. And so you're not even aware of it, right? And that's kind of what's happening. This kind of sense of like, I didn't even realize I was injured. Okay. And that's kind of what happened to me in the car accident. I'd broken my arm and I didn't even realize my arm was broken. And I didn't realize that actually until I tried to open the door, and my arm couldn't open the door because it was broken. I had no force on the door. And so that's when I realized, and I just looked down at my arm, I'm like, oh, my arm's broken. Of course, shortly after that, I can feel the pain of the break, but I was numbed. That my system, my sensory pathways had been modified to kind of take that conscious perception of pain out of the equation. And that happens quite a bit. Okay. So since we're talking about pain, let's take a look at some of the pain pathways. Obviously, we associate pain. It's an unpleasant sort of a thing. We typically will have an emotional component to pain. And so when we factor in that emotional component, we're talking about the limbic system that oftentimes will trigger different types of autonomic, sort of those automatic types of responses, psychological, somatic types of responses. So our pathways can be broken down into two groups. So we have a rapid kind of a pathway, and we have a slow pathway. So basically the rapid pathway is where we're going to be utilizing these large myelinated axons. And so we have our action potentials on these myelinated axons. And so what happens is we get fast, rapid sensation, right? Fast, rapid transmission, which is going to give us a sensation of kind of a sharp, acute kind of cutting pain, right? A quick cutting pain. Quit, not quit, quite. Going to be a quick kind of a cutting pain, like kind of sharp and intense. As opposed to a slowly propagating action potential. So this is obviously going to be a smaller speed. Remember, we talked a little bit about speed with different types of action potential propagations, where we said saltatory was a fast propagation and continuous was a slow propagation. That's associated with myelination versus unmyelinated axons. So you notice it's not surprised that in the slow pathway you have these less myelinated axons. There's fewer of them, resulting in kind of more of a slower, kind of a diffuse burning or achy kind of a pain, kind of what we refer to oftentimes as a dull pain, right? And so those are those slow propagation pains. So what I felt in the car accident was the absence of the rapid because of the endorphins and the enkephalins. But then what I felt later was the slow pathway, that kind of dull ache of the broken arm after the fact that pretty much persisted for a long period of time. So then, so we have what's called the gate control theory. And so the dorsal column, or the medial lemniscal system, or that's the ascending one, is involved in kind of modulating some of this, because some of these action potentials can be suppressed by competing action potentials in this medial lemniscal system. So for instance, the action potentials for pain that are heading up in the spinal thalamic tract, these can be suppressed or inhibited by action potentials in the medial and meniscal system, right? That dorsal column area. And so this is kind of one way to sort of modulate pain and to sort of kind of deal with pain. So notice you have different regulators. You have pain sensation, pain modulation, and pain variation, right? So you have a lot of different nuances. This is beyond what we're talking about with just pain receptors, right? So you have reception, and then this is all the integration piece. It's like not just did you get pain, but how do you perceive the pain? And so if you've ever worked with pain patients or you worked in a pain situation, you notice that people, they internalize pain very differently. And they have completely different ways of how their own perception of pain comes across to them, right? So for some people, they may not really have a good idea of what pain actually is. To them, pain is discomfort. And other people, it hurts. I mean, so there's a lot of different variations. If you've dug into how people respond to pain, there's a lot of different ways of how an individual's nervous system responds to pain itself. And so an analgesic basically takes this kind of approach. So this is a medication that you can take that kind of acts similar to the sort of gate control, basically competes with the pain signals, and then by doing that, it kind of suppresses those pain action potentials so that it basically mutes the effect of the pain. So that's the overall effect of this gate control system. It essentially mutes the pain response because you're suppressing it with other action potentials. And remember, the one thing, I don't think we really covered this piece because this was a piece that I had omitted. It was, I believe, in 12, I believe. Could have been in 13. But we did mention a little bit in passing because remember, you have IPSPs and EPSPs. So inhibitory potential and excitatory potential. So these are like, negative repressor, like a negative type of an act on a neuron versus a positive, an excitatory, inhibitory versus excitatory. And so ultimately what can happen is an IPSP can cancel out the excitatory. So those can cancel each other out. They're competing signals. One is excitatory, the other is inhibitory. And this is kind of a similar idea with the gate control. With the gate control, it's kind of like excitatory versus inhibitory. In this case, the excitatory is the pain. The inhibitory is that suppressing action potential coming from the dorsal column. We also have referred pain, right? So basically, referred pain is kind of that interesting phenomena, which is kind of cool actually when you run into it. But this is basically where you feel a sensation in one region of your body that's not in the same area as the stimulus, right? Usually it's associated with skin. So you basically input the same information to the same spinal segment, and what'll happen is they'll converge on the same ascending neurons. So for instance, we've all done this before, right? Like maybe you scratch your neck and you feel it in your leg, right? Or you feel some sort of a sensation in your leg. And that's basically referred, right? That's basically referred pain. And so this is kind of like some of the areas that you have that are kind of interconnected because they're using some of the same systems. For instance, your neck, liver, and gallbladder, right? So you kind of have these referred pain regions. So each of the colors are basically connected to each other. The ovaries and females on each side. You can feel a little bit in your back for the liver, gallbladder one. Your heart is basically in the back, in the middle of your shoulder blades. Your stomach can be back and stomach at the same time. So you have these different regions of kind of reference where they're kind of interlinked, and kind of causes this interesting kind of an effect. You scratch one area and it basically itches in another, right? How many of you guys have experienced referred pain? Yeah. Yeah, basically anytime you get kind of like a pain where you know where the origin of the pain is coming from, but you have a sensation in a completely different part of the body, that's referred, right? So it doesn't really matter where it is, but that's basically um, kind of a referred situation. So you can actually probably map it out um, in this particular area. Like for instance, if you have your booty cheeks there, that's not the technical term, of course, right? Versus urinary bladder. So you can see how you have different localities associated with some of this. And so that's kind of like, that's just an example of it's just a reminder, right, of how your nervous system is like one big interconnected organ, right? And so what you do in one part of your body is interconnected to all the rest of it. And that's kind of like the perfect example of integration of your body and how your body is more of an integrated whole as opposed to different organ systems that are kind of scotch taped together. So chronic pain is another thing we run into a lot, right? So in chronic pain, basically, you oftentimes won't have necessary response to the immediate injury, so it's not acute, right? But it's kind of low level pain, but enduring, right? That's basically what we're looking at. And it doesn't necessarily have to be low level. It could be high level as well. But the idea is it's enduring. It's not episodic. It's non-episodic. So for instance, some like tissue damage from arthritis, that's very chronic. Talk to anybody who's older and they're starting to get arthritis, or any of you athletes that are getting older and you're starting to feel your knees, and you're looking at probably knee replacement surgery sometime in your future. A lot of that chronic pain is a reality. Basically, it hurts to walk all the time. And so this is something that people run into a lot. And like when you hear an older person say everything hurts, they're not talking usually about like, oh my gosh, it's going to feel like I'm breaking my bones all the time when I'm older. That's not what they're talking about. Most of what they're talking about is this kind of background of chronic pain that's just kind of always there, right? This kind of chronic pain and discomfort, and things of that nature, right? So you have a lot of connective tissue associated with these chronic pains. For instance, back pain is a wear and tear type of a thing. Oftentimes can also be injury as well. But anybody as they get older is going to start having back pain just because of the taxing nature of just having your body weight held up by your by your vertebra, your entire life. I mean, so there's just going to be a certain amount of wear and tear. Migraines, for instance, we're not quite sure what causes those, but they can create chronic pain for people. And so we oftentimes will see this more acutely in individuals with depression or frustrated. Things of this nature can kind of create a lot of this sort of, if you notice, a lot of these kind of run together. So a person struggling with depression is probably also struggling with feelings of hopelessness and helplessness and frustration with it all. And so these oftentimes will kind of run together. And there's a lot of these sorts of things that sort of, especially when you're talking about mental health and chronic pain and how these different things sort of feed together, because chronic pain can have a negative drag on mental health as well. And they kind of tend to all sort of run together. The problem is, if you don't really know what the cause is, you can't really tell whether it's the mental health that is the primary and the chronic pain is secondary to the mental health, or it's vice versa. If the chronic pain is the primary and a secondary causation from that primary cause would be the downstream mental health components. Because we've seen both. We've seen situations where chronic injury or chronic health can start to really wear away on the person's mental health. And so the mental health issues tend to be secondary to the original physical challenge. But now that we're learning more and more about mental health and how to handle it and how to deal with it, we're starting to learn that the mental health can also be primary and start causing secondary problems. And so it's kind of an interesting dynamic to kind of go into. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at the cerebral cortex. So we've been talking a little bit about the spinal cord and some of the main tracks that are associated with the spinal cord, but now let's take a look at the primary sensory areas of the cerebral cortex. So this is kind of where it all is going, right? So that sensory pathway, this is kind of where they're all going. So your primary sensory cortex, remember that's your postcentral gyrus. That's why we learned that in chapter 13. This is your general sensory area. So essentially, this will be that area right behind the central sulcus. This is going to be where you're receiving most of your general sensory information. Notice it says general, not specific, because remember your specific stuff like your eyesight, those have their own associational regions. This is just general stuff like your pain, pressure, temperature, the things we've been talking about. So this basically is going to be associated in what they refer to as an upside down half homunculus, which is a good SAT word, which is just a structure, kind of a structural designation of the shape of the area. And so what's going to happen is the number of sensory receptors in that area will essentially correspond with the size of the region. And so if you have more sensory receptors, the larger the region, things like that. And so you can localize the site of the sensation on the surface of the body to this particular area. And it's kind of cool because we actually have a little diagram that sort of shows how we did this. And it's kind of cool to kind of look at it, what we're talking about here. So the homunculus basically means it's kind of like humanoid. That's basically what it means, kind of the half homunculus, the humanoid. I'm going to show you what the half homunculus looks like here in just a second. But ultimately what happens is these sites will project and kind of spread out according to this sensory cortex, where different regions of this cortex will handle different things according to the surface of the body, right? So for instance, the different types of areas, and we'll take a look at, can be mapped to the brain. So you have the taste area, which is the insula. That's basically where you're going to get your gustation. That's your taste sensation. Olfactory. This is going to be the inferior surface of the temporal lobe. So that's basically going to be down further, kind of right around your ear. Your auditory cortex is going to be in the temporal lobe as well. That's in the superior port. That's what your hearing is. Your visual cortex is in your occipital lobe. So that's basically the reason why if you take a blow to the back of your head, you can black out because it's attacking your visual cortex. This is kind of what it looks like. So here you can see in the dark purple, this is going to be your primary motor cortex, where you can see your lower limb is organized up here at the upper portion of the precentral gyrus. The trunk is a little further down. The upper limb is further down. The head is even further down. And then you can see your central sulcus. And then in the dark green, you're going to see your postcentral gyrus, rather, which is going to be your somatosensory area. Your taste area is this little itty bitty green area that's right next to, or just on the upper portion of the temporal lobe. And then your auditory complex is going to be this piece right here on the bottom portion, the inferior portion of the temporal lobe. And then notice here, the one thing I want to show you here, this is true for all your senses. Notice that right here we have our auditory cortex, right? This is basically bringing in the data. So this is basically brings in your data. But then typically around it, like this area right in here, you have what's called an associational area. So this is basically how your brain perceives the data. So it's like your associational area. And so if you take a look then at your visual cortex, go back to the visual area. Notice you have your visual cortex right here in the back of your occipital lobe. That's basically your visual data. You're just taking in data. And then around that, you're going to have your visual association. So how do you perceive that data, right? A couple of other really important areas of the brain as well is notice you have two different speech areas. So this area right here, which is your Broca area, that's motor speech. That's your ability to form words and to speak. And then further back in your parietal lobe is going to be your Wernicke area. That's basically your sensory speech, your ability to perceive and to understand verbally information that's coming to you. And so you can see there's like major areas of the brain where you can kind of see how you sort of designate different functionalities. Now let's go ahead and take a look at our half homunculus. There's always a lot of fun. Looks like some sort of a mutant creature. But basically, this is kind of like where you can sort of wrap this around. Now what this is a coronal cut. And so you're kind of moving kind of around the cortex of the brain. And so you can see that deep down in that fissure, you're going to have the sensation for the genitals as you start to move up. It's leg, foot, and toes. Then you have your hip, trunk, neck, head, shoulders. So that's a shoulder right there. Your arm, your elbow, your forearm. That's it right there. Your wrist, and then your fingers. You have a lot going on in your fingers. That's why we have a lot of fine motor control. And then you have eye, nose, and face. So that's the reason why we have a big old face right there. Your lips, teeth, and jaw, gums right there. And then the inside, so the pharynx piece, right? So you have your tongue, pharynx, and then intra-abdominal. So you can see that these are all the areas basically as you kind of wrap your way around the outside of that cortex. That's basically the areas that are kind of designated. This is what we're talking about when we're talking about the localization of that site of sensation on the surface of the body. So it projects to these particular areas and they kind of wrap around and designate and basically are sensory associated with those particular areas. So we're looking at this particular area right here, that primary somatosensory post-central gyrus area. So basically we're kind of taking pieces of this, like little strips of this, and we're designating it to different areas of the body. And that's what we're showing here. And so right in here, or right onto the side of it would be the central sulcus. So that's your half homunculus. That's your homunculus. So the sensory areas, the associational areas, are always primary to the main sensory areas, right? So for instance, your somatosensory association area is going to be posterior right next to the primary somatosensory area. Your visual association area is right next to your primary visual area. And so these will be, the important piece here is they integrate information from those primary sensory areas. And they allow you to be able to evaluate and to recognize those areas. And this is really important because a lot of times what can happen is our senses are picking up the same data, right? So for instance, we can smell the same thing. However, our associational area will make an interpretation very differently based on what we think, right? So for instance, maybe we smell a type of perfume, right? So to one person, they're going to be smelling the same thing. Their body's picking up the exact same data. They're smelling the exact same molecule. So the input is the same. but the association is different because what you make out of that is a complete different association. For one person, they may like the smell, and so it starts to engender positive emotions and positive associations. So it triggers other areas of the brain that reinforces positive types of emotions in the limbic system, and also maybe also triggers the pleasure center. They associate it with a pleasant, pleasurable type of experience. Whereas another person who does not like it, the associational area, will have a negative look at it. All of a sudden, they'll have a very negative emotional response to it and will trigger different types of negative associations with it. That's what the associational areas are doing. So remember, your sense of reality isn't necessarily about the information coming into your brain as much as it is what your brain is doing with that information. So the skeletal muscles then are going to be controlled by the motor system, which is essentially going to be maintaining obviously your posture, your balance, your limb movement, all those sorts of things. And so you'll have different types of voluntary movements. Of course, you're going to be consciously activating your muscles, although you'll also be working with reflexes. We talked a little bit about these also, where you have involuntary movements, no conscious thought associated with it. Generally speaking, you have two neurons in this particular situation, upper and lower. The upper ones tend to go directly through interneurons, and they'll connect to the lower. The lower motor neurons usually will leave the central nervous system, go through the peripheral nervous system, and then actually interface with the skeletal muscles. This is sometimes where the cell bodies in your horns, where that's the gray matter part of your spinal cord, will kind of help process these lower motor neurons as they route themselves out to the skeletal muscles. So for voluntary movements, we have three basic steps, right? The first one is your cerebral cortex is going to communicate with the basal nuclei. Remember, we learned about the basal nuclei. That was an important part of the brain associated with muscle movement and coordination. And it's also going to be interacting and communicating with the cerebellum to plan and coordinate those movements, right, between each other. Then the upper motor neuron in that premotor area of the cerebral cortex, right? So that's in that premotor cortex region. Those are going to be stimulated. They're going to start sending out action potentials. They're going to go down the descending tracks, which we associate with motor neurons. And basically, they're going to head toward the lower motor neurons, which are kind of waiting further down near the skeletal muscles to receive the information from the upper motor neurons. And then once the lower motor neurons are stimulated, then they can go directly out to the skeletal muscles to contract. And these are the ones that have the NMJ. What's the NMJ? The neuromuscular junction. So remember learning about that one in chapter 9. This is the one that will have the neuromuscular junction associated with interfacing with that muscle. So the motor areas, we talked a lot about the sensory areas, but the motor areas also have a half homunculus associated with them. We'll take a look at that here in just a second. But your primary motor cortex is basically where you're going to see a good chunk of your upper motor neurons, about a third of them or so. Another are going to be in the premotor area, and the rest are going to be in the somatosensory. Notice it says somato, which is the motor piece. That's what that refers to, and sensory. So a combination of motor and sensory. The premotor area basically is where the primary motor cortex is. This is going to be anterior, a little further to the front of the front of the head. So it's kind of moving toward the forehead area. And so this is where you kind of organize your motor functions. The prefrontal area, this is basically where you kind of do a little bit of planning. So for instance, motivation, the initiation, the planning of the initiation of movements, the emotional behavior, the mood, right? So a lot of this is going to be in that prefrontal area. So if you take a look at this, you can see this is going to be your primary motor cortex, right? That's basically that primary motor gyrus. And then the premotor area is this lighter purple region here. And then the prefrontal is going to be this part right here. So that's basically where you're getting a lot of that mood and so forth. Now, when you take a look at your half homunculus for the motor purposes, right, this is going to be taking a look at your motor cortex. Now, you can see this is also going to be sliced up like this in little pieces designated, just like you had with the sensory, right, with that post-central gyrus, right? So we already looked at this one. This one was already the previous one. That was a sensory piece right there. Now we're going to be looking at the motor piece. And you can see the same thing's happening, right? So down here, you have a little piece that controls the toes, the ankles, knees, hip, trunk. You can see the same idea, the shoulders, elbow, forearm, a lot of the fingers, the thumb, neck, the face, the tongue sticking out there, and the throat. Half homunculus for the motor components. So you can see that basically that half homunculus organization that we saw with the sensory is also true for the motor region as well. So that brings us to the motor pathways. So we talked about the sensory pathways, right? So that was these guys right here and these guys right here. So those are all the sensories. Now we're going to be taking a look at the motors. So these are direct pathways, what we're often referred to as the pyramidal system. And so these guys will be maintaining muscle tone. So that's a constant state of readiness, speed, precision of muscle movements. So your upper motor neurons will actually synapse directly with the lower motor neurons in the brainstem or the spinal cord. And that's in your direct pathway. So they're a direct connection between upper and lower, and the indirect, which are called the extra pyramidal systems. This is for less coordinated types of movements, but ultimately the uppers do not directly synapse with the lowers. And so you can see a couple of major pathways associated with this. So over here in the lateral column, you can see you have anterior, these are direct pathways. The anterior corticospinal, which is down here in your anterior or your ventral column. And you also have the lateral corticospinal, this guy right here. So those are your directs. Your indirects then are next to them. So you have your rubrospinal, which is right next to the lateral corticospinal. You have your reticulospinal, which is this little flap right here. Your tectospinal, which is this guy right here, where we talked a little bit about that one before. And your vestibulospinal, which is this guy right here. So these are all motor pathways associated with motor control. And we're going to take a look at each one of these guys, just like we did with the sensories. So here's our kind of cross-sectional view of things. And so we're going to be taking a look at a couple of them. First of all, the important thing to always start off with is their function, right? So you have control of muscle tone, fine skilled motor movements. So this is fine motor movements right here. That's what these guys are. Very precise, very controlled movements. These are the direct pathways where uppers directly connect to lowers. So your upper is directly going to be synapsing with your lower. And the tracks that you're going to see here are the corticospinal and the corticobulbar. So the corticospinal is essentially going to be movements below the head. Corticobulbar basically is movements in the head and neck. So if you take a look at this then, you're going to see information coming from your motor cortex up here. It's going to be now heading downward. These are descending tracks now at this particular point, going through that cerebral peduncle, where that's the piece that connects the midbrain to the cerebrum. And so these are going by way of your upper motor neurons. Notice they're very long neurons. They're coming all the way down. And then they're going to be moving into the corticospinal tract. In this case, this is your lateral corticospinal tract. You can see it's kind of moving through this particular area. And then it's going to go through anterior corticospinal tract and lateral corticospinal tract, both of those guys together. And then your lower motor neurons are down here. So you can see these guys are the ones that are a little further down. And you notice how your upper neurons are going to connect to your lowers, and then your lowers are going to go out and interface neuromuscular junction style with your muscle. So there's still more to talk about with the corticospinal tracts, because these guys are important. However, we're at our witching hour, so this is a good place to stop and start. So we'll start here on Tuesday.